On the 13th of April 2026, Mark Carney won something the sitting American president has spent 15 months trying to prevent. Not merely an election, but a majority, a parliamentary lock on power until at least 2029, secured through 3 by-elections in Ontario and Quebec, and 5 opposition politicians who, one by one, walked across the floor of the House of Commons and joined the Prime Minister. The American administration has been trying to break this government. 15 months ago, Carney's Liberal Party was 27 points behind in the polls. The party appeared finished. Justin Trudeau had just resigned under sustained pressure from his own caucus. The man positioned to replace him as Prime Minister was a 45-year-old career politician who had held his seat since 2004, built a nationalist coalition, and was running a campaign that looked structurally almost identical to the one that returned the current occupant to the White House. Tonight, that opponent no longer holds a seat in Parliament, and Mark Carney commands a majority. This is one of the most dramatic reversals in the political history of any democracy in the modern world. Understanding how it happened, the specific sequence of decisions, the specific people involved, the specific moments where the narrative turned, is not simply a domestic story. It is a documented case study in what occurs when a country builds a democratic institutional response to economic nationalism and aggressive external pressure, executes it methodically, and then wins. Let us begin with who Mark Carney actually is, because the mainstream coverage often glosses over the part of his biography that explains everything. Carney was never a career politician. He was a central banker. He ran the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013, which means he was the individual steering the nation's economy through the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Subsequently, the British government asked him to run the Bank of England, which he did from 2013 to 2020, managing one of the world's most complex financial institutions through the chaos of the Brexit referendum and its aftermath. He later chaired a major global asset management firm. He has spent his entire professional life doing one thing: walking into rooms where the situation was deteriorating rapidly and stabilizing the environment. When the previous Prime Minister resigned and the Liberal Party needed a new leader, Carney won that contest with more than 85% of the party vote. It was not because party members adored him as a political performer. He had never run for office in his life. It was because the country was staring down a 25% tariff on its exports to the United States. The American president was publicly suggesting Canada should cease to exist as a sovereign nation and become a subordinate state. Liberals understood that the person they required was not a great communicator or a retail politician. They required someone who had actually managed crises of this magnitude before. Carney himself articulated this plainly on the campaign trail. "When things are good, you probably do not want me. It is when things are in a state of crisis that I am at my best." That framing was deliberate, and it resonated deeply with an anxious electorate. Now here is the reality about his primary opponent that surface coverage missed entirely. The Conservative leader was not a weak candidate. He was, by almost any objective measure, an exceptionally strong one. He had held his Ottawa area seat for 21 years. He had built a genuine populist coalition that was fiscally conservative, culturally combative, and anti-elite in a manner that resonated with a large base. His 27-point polling lead over the Liberals was not an accident. It was the product of a real movement built over years that genuinely reflected a large segment of Canadian political sentiment. The problem for him was not that his politics were inherently wrong. The problem was that the rhetoric and actions from the White House made his politics structurally impossible to run on. Consider the specific bind he found himself in. His platform and his rhetoric called for smaller government, tighter borders, and anti-establishment cultural messaging. Those positions did not just resemble the American president's platform, they were philosophically aligned with it. This meant that when the American leader began threatening annexation, slapping punitive tariffs on Canadian goods, and posting on social media on the morning of a Canadian election urging voters to make the country a subsidiary state, the Conservative leader was trapped. He could not credibly run against the American president without abandoning the ideological framework his entire coalition was built upon. Yet he could not run with that president without committing political suicide in a country that was watching its sovereignty get challenged in real time. His response of standing up from a position of strength was not incoherent, but it was too late and too similar to language that his opponent was using more convincingly, with more credibility and with a cleaner financial biography. On the 28th of April 2025, Canadian Election Day, the American president posted on social media instructing Canadians to elect the man who would cut their taxes and quadruple their industries, while adding the explicit suggestion of making the country a cherished subordinate territory. He appeared to be referring to himself. It was one of the most extraordinary acts of foreign interference in a democratic election in recent memory, and it occurred in broad daylight. Carney won that night. He carried 169 seats. He won the popular vote with the highest Liberal share in decades, and his opponent lost his own seat, the riding he had held since 2004, to a first-time Liberal challenger. Let that sink in. The man who had been 27 points ahead in the polls lost not just the election, but his own parliamentary seat. The last time a party leader lost their seat was over 3 decades ago. But here is what Carney did not have on election night 2025, a majority. He had 169 seats. A majority in Canada's 343-seat House of Commons requires 172. He was 3 seats short, which meant he was leading a minority government, one that needed opposition support to pass legislation, one that could fall on a confidence vote at any moment, one that gave his opponents leverage to stall, delay, and complicate every piece of his agenda. For the first year of his government, that constraint was real. Fewer than half of the bills his government introduced became law. He required the support of other parties or at least some cooperative opposition members to move anything significant. That constraint mattered enormously in the context of what was coming, a trade negotiation with the American administration that would define the country's economic relationship with its largest trading partner for a generation. Carney needed a freer hand. Over the next 12 months, he got one through a sequence of events that has almost no precedent in Canadian parliamentary history. 5 opposition politicians over 5 months one by one crossed the floor of Parliament and joined Mark Carney's Liberals. The first thing to understand about floor crossings, defections in plain language, is that they are not common in Canadian politics. They happen, but 5 in 5 months, all flowing in the same direction toward the same government, is a different kind of signal. Only 2 governments in Canadian history have seen more defections to the ruling party. One was the country's first Prime Minister. The other governed during one of the most economically prosperous stretches in modern history. Carney's defection total is being built in the middle of a trade war. The most telling of the 5 was a member named Marilyn Gladu. Gladu was not a peripheral figure in the Conservative Party. She was a long-standing member, a former chemical engineer, and a recognizable voice on the right. When she switched parties on the 8th of April 2026, she did not offer a vague statement about personal principles. She said explicitly that the country needed a serious leader who could address the uncertainty that had arrived due to unjustified American tariffs. That sentence is important because Gladu is not a progressive ideologue. She has in the past held positions at odds with the liberal mainstream on social and environmental issues. She is not someone who woke up one morning and decided she was a leftist. She made a calculation, a specific, named, stated calculation, that on the defining issue of this political moment, Carney was the competent choice and her own party was not. When she crossed, the Conservative leader accused Carney of seizing a costly majority that voters denied him through backroom deals. That is a real political critique. The voters of that particular riding elected a Conservative. They did not vote for a Liberal government. Floor crossings are legal, but they are not without democratic tension, and the objection raised by the opposition leader is not frivolous. Yet here is the political reality the opposition leader is living inside right now. He survived a leadership review in January 2026, meaning his own party had a formal vote on whether to keep him and chose to, but barely. His polling numbers for preferred prime minister sit in the low 20s against Carney's mid-50s. He leads a caucus that has been hemorrhaging members to the government he is supposed to be opposing, and the argument that Carney's majority is illegitimate, that it was bought, not won, has a ceiling because the voters of University Rosedale just gave Carney's candidate 65% of the vote. The voters of Scarborough Southwest just delivered 70%. Those are not close races. Those are landslides. In ridings that have voted Liberal before, yes, but by margins that exceed what the Liberals posted in those same ridings at the general election. The direction of travel as of the 13th of April 2026 is unambiguous. So what does Carney actually have now that he did not have last April? The most important thing is this. He cannot be removed from power by a no-confidence vote anytime soon. Under a minority government, any bad week, a budget dispute, a coalition partner threatening to walk, or an unexpected scandal creates a potential election trigger. Minority governments in Canada typically last less than 2 years. Carney now controls a majority in a 343-seat parliament until October 2029, barring something extraordinary. That is not a small thing in the context of what is coming. The trade negotiation with the United States is the defining external challenge of Carney's government. The 25% tariffs on Canadian goods remain in place. The terms of a new economic relationship between the two countries, one that Carney has described as replacing a framework based on integration with one based on independence, still need to be negotiated. Those negotiations are going to be complex, contentious, and long. A minority prime minister entering those talks carries a structural weakness that a majority prime minister does not. Every concession Carney makes in a trade negotiation is a potential attack line for the opposition in the next confidence vote. Every compromise, every delay, every moment where the public mood turns impatient, all of that becomes leverage for the opposition to threaten the government's survival. The American negotiating team understands this. They have watched minority governments fall. They know what a confidence vote is. Carney now removes that leverage. He can negotiate without an election gun pointed at his head. He can make the hard decisions, accepting pain in the short term, refusing concessions that would be politically unpopular but strategically necessary, without worrying that a smaller party will pull the plug on his government the following Tuesday. This is what he meant when he told reporters before the by-elections that a majority would help him deal more effectively with the trade war. It was not a rhetorical flourish. It was a precise technical statement about the structural conditions of negotiation. A leader who can be toppled is a weaker negotiator than a leader who cannot. There is a larger story sitting underneath all of this that warrants direct acknowledgement before we close. Canada in 2026 is not just a country managing a trade dispute with a difficult neighbor. It is functionally the first Western democracy to have run a full political experiment in building institutional resistance to aggressive external pressure, and to have won at the ballot box twice. The experiment includes specific documentable components. A leader chosen not for charisma but for crisis competence. A campaign that named the threat explicitly without flinching. A political opponent whose ideological positioning was weaponized against him by the actual behavior of the foreign leader he was compared to. And now a parliamentary majority built in part by opposition politicians who looked at the landscape and concluded that the governing party was the competent choice for this specific emergency. An analysis of the 2025 election result noted that in no country have the political effects of the current American administration been more dramatic than in Canada. That observation was correct then, and it is even more correct now. What comes next matters enormously. Carney has pledged to work with all parties, even with his majority, and has framed his agenda around building what he calls a more resilient, more self-reliant nation. His government wants to move faster on expanding energy exports, reducing dependence on American markets, and on pushing through legislation the opposition has blocked, including an online harms bill. He has until 2029. The question that Western democracies are going to be watching, and this is the question to leave with, is whether the Carney model is transferable, whether the specific architecture of what Canada did, the calibrated messenger, the explicit anti-pressure mandate, the patient consolidation of parliamentary power, the refusal to flinch, whether that is a template or whether it was a perfect storm that will not repeat. There is no definitive answer. But the evidence shows that in a country that shares a 5,500-mile border with the United States, that conducts over $2 trillion in annual bilateral trade, that has been told by the sitting American president that it should cease to exist as a sovereign nation, the voters just gave the man standing in that doorway a majority mandate for the second time with larger margins than the first. Mark Carney told supporters on the night of April 13th, "We accept that support with humility, determination, and a clear understanding of what this moment demands." He is right that this moment demands clarity, and what is clear tonight is that the country has decided not once but twice that it knows exactly who it is, and it is not a subordinate territory.